Good morning, Bhargav. It's Thursday, the 23rd of February. Here's the heads up brief for today. For the Southeast Asia production, we covered 22 issues. North Asia, we covered 7. And for the Australasian Pacific Islands, we covered 8. In South Asia, we covered 16 issues, plus the major issues in the Europe, Middle East, and Africa regions.
Hello there. Which are the major issues today across the Asia Pacific region?
Right, Bhargav. So starting off with Papua New Guinea, one of the female hostages who was kidnapped the other day in the Southern Highlands by an armed gang was freed. Security forces are trying to see whether they can free the remaining hostages, one of whom is an Australian citizen.
Uday, this is interesting. We have been advising clients and businesses across the region about how kidnapping is a persistent issue and there needs to be a more comprehensive approach. So we'll have to see how this develops in the coming weeks. And given that the trigger-happy government authorities, we do not know how this will evolve if they become trigger-happy, especially.
Definitely. And it's similar in Indonesia where in terms of the hostage taking incident in Papua, authorities said that they know where the hostage is being held, uh, but they've not done any operations yet because New Zealand authorities have asked them not to use force for the safety of the hostage, who is a New Zealand national. So it's a similar dynamic there. We'll have to see how it plays out.
Thank you.
Right. Also in Indonesia, Bhargav. So, the country is introducing tax cuts for financial institutions, for the new capital, Nusantara, to spur investment over there. This is part of their plan to shift the capital to Nusantara, which has been going slower than the government wants.
There's been a lot of talk about moving of capital to the new location. And now the announcement of tax cuts is very interesting. And we need to see if we can produce an assessment on how this is going to benefit or it's unlikely to benefit businesses. So that maybe you can take that up further
Yeah,
with our team.
sure, we'll do that, Bhargav. All right. Moving on to Singapore. So the Internal Security Department said that they had detained a teenage terror suspect last year, and they're monitoring another teenager. This is more of the pattern that we see in Singapore of suspects getting radicalized online, and Singaporean authorities taking a very proactive approach to countering the threat of terrorism in the country, as opposed to some of the neighboring countries, some of the countries in the neighborhood.
Yes, Singapore's proactive approach is quite evident, and they have been successful in averting quite a few plots in the last couple of decades, and it is refreshing compared to other countries in the region, especially in comparison to South Asia and the Middle East, where the tendency is to react rather than be proactive.
Yep, I think that's a failure of counterterrorism in most places. But anyway, Bhargav, moving on to South Asia, in regarding Pakistan, the Pakistani defense minister and the ISI chief met with senior Afghan Taliban figures in Kabul yesterday. They were discussing on how to control the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. So it seems that Pakistan is still going with the policy of the good Taliban, bad Taliban, and still believes that they can encourage the good Taliban, which is the Afghan Taliban, to crack down on the bad Taliban, which is the Pakistani Taliban. This hasn't worked in the past, Bhargav. What do you think about this?
This is a comical situation. I can't help but say that because the very notion of breeding a militia, a radicalized militia for good causes and expect them to behave when it comes to their own backyard is ludicrous at best. Pardon my language, but that's what it is. And they had to pay a heavy price back in 2007, and it turns out it's very similar this time around as well. As the radical militia, the Taliban in Afghanistan, came to power, they went out of control, at least under the Ashraf Ghani government, when Taliban was an insurgent force. Pakistan had some amount of control because they were the primary beneficiaries of Taliban. It was evident from Faiz Hamid, the chief of ISI, driving down to Kabul the moment they came to power, or flying down rather. So now that they're in power, they've gone out of control, and that is reflective in their own backyard when TTP has gone haywire. They're creating ruckus everywhere they go. So it's a comical situation. I mean, when they say the good Taliban and bad Taliban, they don't seem to understand the writing on the wall.
Right. Bhargav, in Bangladesh, two armed Rohingya groups clashed in a camp in the Rohingya camps in the Cox's Bazar area. The fighting occurred between members of the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army and the Rohingya Solidarity Organization. There's been increasing violence in the camps in Bangladesh over the last few months.
Uday, this is going to be quite critical for Bangladeshi government and cross-border relations as well, because whenever there is a vulnerable population in refugee camps, record has shown that the level of radicalization and recruitment by nefarious or terror groups increase. So Bangladesh government needs to be proactive in tackling this as best as possible, because it's a very volatile situation in the region.
Right. Lastly, Bhargav, in the Europe, Middle East, and Africa region, a Russian hacking group targeted several Italian and government institutions and companies yesterday. This came after Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni visited Ukraine. The hackers also targeted banks and a telecom company. So they've warned of future cyber attacks if Italy continues to support Ukraine.
All right.
That's the brief for today, Bhargav. Anything else from you?
Thank you. That was a good brief. Nothing from my end.
All right, thanks.